Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on your time zone. Welcome to our inaugural session on innovation. In this series, we're going to talk about what does it take for small and medium-sized businesses to innovate. I'm Beth Semplatsky-Mortori, your moderator. I'm a partner and a CMO with Chief Outsiders, and I'm here with my colleagues, Angus and Amit. A little bit about me. I have extensive experience in phase-gate processes. I worked at Philips for a long time, and as you can well imagine, they've had a very comprehensive phase-gate process. And then after that, I worked at a couple of large companies, but not like Philips, and we implemented phase-gate processes. And since I've been at Chief Outsiders, I've implemented what I'm calling phase-gate light processes for several of my client companies. So that's enough about me. Without further ado, let's introduce our panel. We'll start off with my colleague, Angus Robertson.
Thanks so much, Beth. Great to be here, and great to be here with my esteemed colleagues, yourself and Ahmet. So like yourself, I'm a CMO with Chief Outsiders, and I focus on demand generation for SaaS companies. My background is rooted in product management and product marketing, primarily in the world of tech and even telecom. And I really care about the phase-gate process because in my experience, if you don't have that, you see chaos ensue pretty quickly. So I've actually helped implement a phase-gate process at a $500 million global manufacturer, and I actually ran the business gate case for that for several years. And it's a very valuable component of the overall phase-gate. And then I also led the NPI, or New Product Introduction process, for 3 SaaS startups who, before I joined, didn't have any of that.
Well, thank you, Angus. I know there are members of our audience that are really interested in learning how SaaS companies innovate, and we're looking forward to hearing your insights and other learnings as we go along. And now, let me introduce our second panel member, Amit. Thanks, Amit.
Thank you, Beth, and great to be here with 2 great minds. And I'm Ahmet Abaji, also CMO with Chief Outsiders. I consider myself a problem solver engineer that has switched to the dark side of marketing. My background is really full of successes and failures in a variety of companies. And when you're talking about innovation, you have to be comfortable talking about your failures. So I worked in fast-moving consumer goods, medical devices, footwear, apparel, durables, OTC supplements, a wide variety, which I'm gonna look forward to sharing those insights from. But one key tip for you: although different categories they're very different from each other, they are all the same, and there's a lot of common principles when it comes to innovation between them.
Thank you, Amit. You're going to bring, with all that experience, a rich perspective on how companies can innovate and develop new products. So we're very excited to welcome you to this session. Although you most likely have experience with new product innovation, introduction, and development, do you have a strategy, culture, and process to achieve predictable growth? That's the question we're going to help answer today. Or as a small and medium-sized business, do you operate more on what we've been calling the one and done or the one-hit wonder spectrum of the scale? Anyway, hoping that you somehow find your next new product when your current products run out of steam. In this series, which is 4 parts, we're going to talk about the common principles again across B2C, B2B, and SaaS companies for innovation. So as we go along, we'd like to keep this session interactive. So if you hear something you like or agree with, or maybe disagree with, please go ahead and put that up in the comments. Also, if you have any questions, please put that up in the comments. We'll monitor those and try to keep the session interactive and answer them as we go along. And then, of course, at the end of the session, we'll have time for questions. So we've got 3 topics we're talking to you today. 2 of them are sort of setup topics. And then the third, we start to dive into what the NPD process looks like that we're going to talk about. Anyway, the first one is why do we need a process anyway for product portfolio management, which sort of encompasses the whole spectrum before we get into a specific new product development. And then also around that whole process is then the importance of company culture. How does company culture influence your innovation? Then finally, we'll get into the part where we talk about reproducible new product introduction or development, with a discussion of why, with all the different NPD processes out there, that we recommend for our client companies a Stagegate-like process. And along the way, we'll share some well-known company case studies, as well as experiences from our own backgrounds. So anyway, let's kick off with the rationale why we need a process for product portfolio management. Many of you probably know there's some big innovative, or at least considered to have been innovative, Goliath companies out there that have dominated their market for decades. And then they've been wounded, right? If not killed, at least wounded by a point solution provider, a David, so to speak, because they were too set in their innovative ways. So if it can happen to a Goliath, can it happen to you? Anyway, with that question, we're going to turn it over to Angus for his perspective on why companies need to innovate or die.
Thank you, Beth. And I think you made a really good point there about it's so interesting because obviously the three of us came from very different backgrounds and industries, but once we started talking about our passion for innovation and our experience with Stagegate, it was kind of cool in a way to see where the similarities were and where the differences were. And I think that really helped us figure out that we wanted to do this. But to your point, this concept of innovate or die, for good or bad, I think somewhat dominates or controls me. It's been burned into my brain. And I think that's because I come from the background of tech or SaaS, where there's so much disruption. There's more and more platforms, which make it easier for that tech disruption to happen. In fact, I think my favorite quote is from Andy Grove, who was the past CEO of Intel, "Only the paranoid survive." I'm not sure it's a great way to live, but unfortunately, that's where I am most of the time. So let's start with the story. How many of you have heard of the Dollar Shave Club? You may remember that video that went viral in 2011, 2012 with the big, in the warehouse with the big teddy bear, but they certainly disrupted their space, and in particular, companies like Gillette. So the shaving industry is a $3.5 billion industry, and there was actually quite a high potential for disruption in the industry. The incumbents are very comfortable. They're making recurring revenue. Everybody has to shave every day. Well, a lot of us do anyway. And these incumbents were very comfortable because there's that steady, almost annuity revenue stream with nice big margins. Just to maintain their margins, they just needed to add one more blade every year or so. However, buying razors was quite inconvenient in addition to the high prices, and with that comfort came sort of a stodgy image as well. And so enter in 2011 the Dollar Shave Club, which made it a lot more convenient for shavers like myself to buy razors, and also much lower pricing. And they were very savvy when it came to social media. And of course, they had that fun, upstart, disruptive, underdog type image, which really resonated with the frustration a lot of consumers were having at the time. And certainly the technology and social media, for example, and globalization helped level the playing field. So before you know it, in 5 years, they've generated $200 million in revenue, and Dollar Shave Club gets bought by Unilever for $1 billion, much to the chagrin of incumbents like Gillette. And actually, over that time, from about 2013 to 2017, about 17 billion shifted from these large brands to these smaller brands because of that technology and also globalization. Interesting story, huh?
Yeah, it is a very interesting story. So what in your experience, that's one who got caught off guard. What in your experience is a best practice that may not have left Gillette vulnerable to the Dollar Shave Club? And do you have an example you'd like to share with us?
So I do think avoiding this type of disruption is possible. I think it's very difficult because once you become a big company, you get known for a certain brand and a certain set of capabilities, and you've got that nice revenue stream and nice margin coming in. You really don't want to mess with it, right? It's just too good. And companies like Kodak learned that the hard way too. They actually, as many of you know, invented the digital camera, but didn't take advantage of that. It was a young engineer in his 20s who came up with the idea, and the executives weren't too interested in hearing that. They were quite happy with their existing film business. And I would say Microsoft is an exception here in what they did with their on-premise Office 365 and moving that to cloud-based Office 365 or Microsoft 365 was certainly very disruptive to their business. They go from a perpetual pricing model to an online subscription. They're losing revenue, but they're also able to take share. And frankly, if they hadn't have done that, I do believe that the Google Suite or Google Workplace would be in a stronger position. And myself, I've been on both sides of the spectrum where we didn't innovate in time and we didn't move forward as quickly as possible. However, I was lucky enough to be involved with an executive team and a product team where actually last year during the pandemic, we saw a big shift in our space. So we were making backup software and doing this backup software for small businesses. All of a sudden, about half of us start working from home. And now we don't really need that appliance backing up those PCs at work. You have executives and remote workers who need to back up their laptops from home. So we changed our roadmap. We launched a cloud backup service, and we're able to refactor our roadmap and launch within 6 months. So before the end of last year. And that made a big difference for us. It did cannibalize some of our existing business, but there was a new market and also market share to pursue. So I think, as is illustrated by this diagram, it's important to have an overall strategy about who you want to be and the conversations and solutions you want to own in your market, and then constantly take ideas from your market. So your market is really just a combination of personas with common pain points that talk to each other. So it's important that you listen to them as well throughout the product management, the engineering, and even the marketing and sales process, and in a very disciplined way, get information back into the process as well. So it is possible, but it's definitely tough.
Well, thank you for sharing your perspective, and especially with that very timely example of how to innovate through the pandemic. We are seeing a lot of companies that are requiring chief outsiders to come in and look for help making a pivot with their innovation strategy. And that's a nice example of how things are changing. So anyway, Angus, Amet, I don't know why I'm doing that, but you're both.
I look like Angus.
Oh, yes.
We get mistaken, people confuse us all the time. So yeah, it's fine. Man.
I even sound like him.
So Amet, let's turn to you and hear a second introductory example and turn to the importance of company culture, right? So how does company culture influence how firms innovate, whether they're large or small?
I think it is the most important thing for any CEO leader to consider before they, start on their journey to innovate, to have the right culture that nurtures the right behaviors. We're all human. We all look for, fitting in. We all look for reassurance. So there's a huge human element to innovation. But when I say, let me just define culture and what defines culture in the context of innovation. It's as simple as what gets rewarded and what gets punished in an organization. Think about many of you may have heard somebody leaving to pursue personal interests after a failed project that cost the company maybe a lot of money. Right? So what does that signal to the organization? You have to think about that. failing is not acceptable, and you're going to lose your income and ruin your career if you fail innovation. That drives certain types of behaviors. But in my mind, we can talk about culture for a very long amount of time. There are two key elements to ensure that are in place to have a environment that nurtures innovation. The first one is curiosity. What do I mean by curiosity? It's sort of this mindset of we don't need time tellers, we need clock builders that are going to think about the concept and dig deep and really enjoy understanding why people do what they do. Many times organizations reward quick action, ready, fire, aim approaches that can lead to random acts of marketing or innovation. That is not the right formula for success in innovation. The second piece is really being externally centric. That sounds very generic, but when innovation is about your customer, the ecosystem you live in, and creating value for them, if you constantly have feedback coming into your process from outside of your building, then you're going to increase your success rate. But if your innovation efforts are driven by internal dynamics, like trying to avoid conflict, I don't want to debate that, it doesn't lead anywhere, or relying on overconfidence of your 30-year veteran leaders, then you're going to have a lower success rate than what you desire.
So thank you for that. So do you have an example where perhaps a company's culture let them vulnerable to a competitor and as a best practice? And then do you have one from your own experience where it was successful?
Yeah, absolutely.
And Ahmet, before you jump in, we actually have some questions. So first, a comment from George. I completely agree. Cannibalism begins at home. And then Jeffrey has a question, I think, for you, Ahmet. How do you bring all the stakeholders into a light Stagegate process? For example, if you sell through retailer channels, how do you bring a retailer into the process to provide you with some insights to your early prototype? Any thoughts there?
I think there are multiple ways to do that, but I would start with what is the reason for different stakeholders to participate in that discussion? Creating that reason for everybody to come together to work together. And if you don't clearly elaborate that, why would a retailer, let's say a big box Walmart or whatever industry you're in, would collaborate with you? Then this is not going to happen. I think that needs to be clearly defined before you even try that.
Makes sense. And Beth, I think this is a great question for you. And I can answer the last one before handing back to Ahmet. But Joe asks, R&D is a considerable obstacle that comes with innovation, but how do you correctly continue to innovate your footprint for your customers with as little internal disruption as possible? Is half a step backward worth the 2 steps forward?
Okay, so as we move forward, we're going to talk about sort of change management techniques and things that we do. But yes, I think these examples talk a little bit about why you need to take a look at your marketplace and be willing to maybe take a half a step backwards to go ahead and move forward. Angus talked about Microsoft, right? So they gave up some pricing and some other things, right? A half step backwards, but they also protected their flank. And so I think part of that is then bringing in all the market insights so that you don't miss what's going on your marketplace and seeing what especially point solution competitors might be doing to your portfolio.
And there's a great question. This is something I think about a lot. For expansion stage companies, how do you decide if product expansion or market expansion, geography or verticals, is the right move for companies to scale? And I think it all comes down to maturity and demand. And this is a great thing to think about and constantly compare those two. And of course, look at the cost and the risk for you to bring a new product to market versus enter a new market through a new channel. And that can often be done on both both sides of the coin with strategic partnerships. But I always like to focus on the market that you know and really satisfy your value proposition and feel like you have the sales velocity and the momentum to succeed before entering a new geographical market. So for me, it's starting with the product and use case and making sure you can satisfy those personas and those pain points, that market segment, and then finding other market segments that look like that so you can continue to saturate those other geographical or vertical markets. And then when you're ready to add that new capability, do so as well. So Ahmet, sorry to interrupt, but back to you for your examples. Great questions, though.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to my answer before I dive into the example. I remember when I was CMO of Mizuno, I was sitting in front of a executive from a major sporting goods retailer, and he said, you know what, when we promote this major national brand, they take share away from the other one. When we promote the other brand, they take share away from the first one. So net, we don't benefit. So we need to work with you and collaborate with you to grow our sales overall. So those are the type of examples that I meant when I said you need to find the reason why different stakeholders would come together to innovate. And in that context, innovation was not just product innovation, but overall innovation. So I'm going to continue to give you an example on how culture may have led to the demise of a very major brand, and the writing is, or the picture is on the slide in this case. Think about a very, very successful tech company that reached $82 billion market cap in 2008, 2 years after the iPhone was launched, and earned social reputation as the crack bearer, right? Everybody was using it and talking about it. Now, BlackBerry's rise to the top was amazing, as it was the fall. Earlier this year when I looked at it, their market cap was around $6 billion, so less than 1/10. Can you? I think back in 2008, nobody in BlackBerry's headquarters imagined such a future, right? They were probably over the clouds. So what might have happened? Now, I was not working for BlackBerry, but I can put on my hat and of having worked in different companies with different cultural problems when it comes to innovation, and hypothesize and very likely case scenarios. Number one, they were probably too focused on their success and internal partying during that time, making huge bonuses, breaking records, and all of that. And they thought they had an insurmountable edge with corporate IT departments and purchasers. They missed the growing popularity of iPhone among consumers who happened to be employees, who happened to go and tell their IT departments they like the iPhone, and it would be great if their companies offered that. The second thing that probably happened, a very likely scenario, is that there were BlackBerry employees who saw the rise of the iPhone and wanted to say something about it, but they were either hesitant to talk or they were seen as pretty much party poopers if they did. So it's very, very important for companies to see their soft belly and act. And how do you ensure that? Let me give you a good example from my experience years ago. We were in a product review meeting at a multi-billion-dollar company, and there was an engineering impasse, and the president started offering his personal ideas on how to solve that design problem. What happened immediately after that meeting was all the engineers and project managers took his idea, the president's idea, as orders and stopped everything else and started executing on that idea. When I saw what was happening, I immediately went to the president and I said, this is what's happening. I don't think this is what you meant, but we have a problem. So he had the vision and the humility to call back the team and say, no, I did not mean that as orders. I meant that as a thinking style, how to approach the problem. So he went from, he was perceived as a time teller but he corrected that and he became a clock builder because then he explained his thinking style to the organization. So the point is, if you are a leader managing innovation, managing organizations, surround yourselves with people who can speak up, create a safe environment for people to speak up and have a debate, then you're more likely to increase your innovation success rate.
Well, thank you, Ahmet. So why don't we go on and turn back to Angus, who's now going to dive into why we're recommending for our small and medium-sized clients at Chief Outsiders what we're calling the Phase-Gate Light process to help you achieve reproducible, profitable innovation and growth for product development. Okay, Angus. You're muted.
It's the most common thing. It's like, can you hear me now? It's like, oh, you're muted now. So I haven't worked for companies quite as large as yourself, Beth, or Ahmet. So I worked for quite a long time at a $500 million company. And I just took for granted, frankly, our operational capability. And then I went to work sort of 2-3 years at a time, these different tech SaaS startups, which were amazing when it came to growth and innovation. But from an operation diligence standpoint or operational efficiency standpoint, we were really pretty bad. And it was such a stark contrast between the $500 million company and the $15 million company. And I didn't realize I had all this expertise on the Phase-Gate side. But what I experienced is just this concept of, especially for SMBs and entrepreneurial companies, stay away from that shiny object. And this is from my experience with a lot of SaaS startups in that $5 to $50 million range. And so what I saw is many half-finished projects, all these great ideas that just litter the floor and the history of the go-to-market. But perhaps at the end of the day, only 1 or 2 products that really were successful and generated more than 80% of the revenue. So a lot of effort and wasted time going down these paths that turned out not to be productive. And actually, at the end of the day, can severely undermine the enterprise value of the company. So you can have this startup that has this amazing initial idea, but then is not able to build on that idea and innovate consistently. So what I see with these entrepreneurial companies is you have a lot of excitement, and the CEOs can be very charismatic, very knowledgeable, and as you highlighted before, Ahmet, really sway the whole organization. And with these ideas, excitement, and just this readiness and passion to execute, but you miss the plan, and there's not really the patience for the plan, or really understanding and doing the research or the customer interviews and getting the alignment and understanding what the objectives are and measuring towards those milestones. So the Phase-Gate process forces that plan and helps companies avoid those squirrel moments.
Well, thank you, Angus. Now I'm going to use an example from the other end of the spectrum, right? So a lot of the companies I work with are operationally focused, right? So I work with small and medium-sized manufacturers, perhaps either B2C or B2B, but they're manufacturers and they've got an operationally oriented mind frame. So what I find is always easier to implement change in a company when you're building on the capabilities they already have. And so having a formal process laid out is something they're comfortable with responsibilities and who helps with what. So it helps jumpstart companies along the process because they're comfortable with it. But I've also observed in smaller operationally focused companies, there's an informal process, usually around product development. I can tell you, even in a workshop, the CEO is finding out that sales is putting products in to new product development and skipping everything else without anybody knowing. And so a lot of times that happens, sales gets a customer who needs a new product. So it's one customer. Does that really answer the business case because it's one customer? Or a competitor introduces a new product and we got to have me too. So then you have no strategy around your product portfolio management, and there's no approval for spending all these resources on products. So anyway, but the process, it's good to have the process. And but the other thing though, so we talk about using something that they know and build on. We also are introducing something new usually in the small and medium-sized companies when we implement the Stagegate Lite, and that's the cross-functional nature of NPD. So a lot of times this is the first time in the organization where they need to work cross-functionally. And usually it's product management, engineering, marketing, and sales working together as a team, regardless of what you call those functions, right? In many cases, it's the first time they're trying it. And in smaller companies, they may even only have generalized marketing and engineering. They may not even have all the functions. And so one of the things I do with my Chief Outsiders companies is help them do a resource roadmap on how to plan out even for those roles and responsibilities as they grow and develop and get more specialized. So I work with them to divide out the specialized responsibilities from the generalized as they add in maybe product management or brand marketing or whatever. And so why do I recommend a light version? Well, light is because many times these smaller organizations, they are nimble and they don't have a lot of resources. And so we want to make sure that you don't become overly bureaucratic and weigh the organization down with too many rules, too much paperwork, and add to their workload, because then they're not going to adopt those new processes. So the Stagegate Lite is a good balance between process and responsibility, but also trying to allow the organization to still capitalize on its smallness and nimbleness. So that's my rationale. Amit, why do you recommend a Stagegate Lite process for your Chief Outsiders clients?
Many good reasons. And in my mind, it's as simple as when you're running a business, you are in risk, right? Life is full of risk. When it comes to innovation, many companies take too much risks. They take the ready, shoot, aim approach. That's too much risk, and you're without any checks and balances in terms of the investment you're making, market validation, and all of that. On the other end of the spectrum, many companies believe they are being conservative by being maybe a fast follower and things like that. So they're taking too little risk, but in my mind, they're also taking pretty high risk because they are jeopardizing their long-term future by not trying to become leaders in the innovation space. So a good process, actually, the way to think about a good process in my mind is managing risk to really increase your market success rate. Process can be a scary word for some people in organizations, especially the really entrepreneurial ones, but it helps you manage the risk while still achieving your goals. That's why I recommend the Lite process.
Well, thank you, Amit. And so now as we're starting to wrap up, I'll continue with you and ask you about your key takeaway. So what is your key takeaway, Amit?
I would say, if you could remember one thing, remember that innovation starts with curiosity. If as a leader you're not curious, your organization won't be curious. If your organization is not curious, no matter what you implement, process, or anything else, you're not going to be able to innovate. So I would say take that curiosity and start by imagining what your business can achieve if you could innovate better. Paint that picture in your mind. That will lead you to find the answers to how to get there.
Well, thank you. Now I'll share my key takeaway. So mine is based upon the cross-functional nature of the process. And because the process is cross-functional, it is going to require some change management in the organization and perhaps even cultural change, along with a key executive to champion the process and lead the teams along, because they're going to need somebody to clear out the roadblocks and things as they move forward. So anyway, change management requires clear roles and responsibilities, right? People need to know what's expected of them and where they play. And so a lot of times what I find really helpful in introducing cross-functional management into an organization is using a RACI matrix, also called a responsibility matrix, right? RACI, R-A-C-I. R is responsible, A is accountable, C is consulted, and I is informed. And so the responsible party is the person who does the work. The accountable party is responsible for making sure the project gets done or that particular phase gets done on time, on budget, and moves those roadblocks out of the way. Many times it's the executive level manager of the responsible party. In smaller organizations, though, the responsible and the accountable party can be the same person. C is consulted, and that's usually the other members of the team who is not the responsible party for that phase gate, because that's a trade-off depending on where you are in the process. And they're consulted. Their expertise is required at each stage, and so they have input. And the last but not least is informed. And a good example of informed is somebody who's not on the team, and that's usually customer service. How many times have you heard, God, we introduced, well, why is the phone ringing off the hook? Or why are the chats going crazy? Well, we introduced a new product and we forgot to tell anybody about it. So when you have a good, well-functioning process in and you have this all outlined, you don't forget those things. Customer service is trained, they have all the Q&As, and they're staffed up for your lunch. Anyway, just remember, anytime you are changing a process or maybe even trying to change the culture, that you do need to have clear roles and responsibilities and an executive level champion. Okay, Angus, what is your key takeaway?
Sure. Before I dive into my key takeaway, Jeffrey's asked another good question, and that is, I doubt that Dollar Shave Club never or ever used a Stagegate process. It would have added 3 years to their launch. Isn't Stagegate like a 20th century idea? So I think it's a really good question, and I do agree. I think that innovative startups, they don't start with a Stagegate process. They start with something that, a pain that they can really feel and a frustration that they really feel, and then they say, I can do something about this, and I know some people who can help me that can do something about this, and I know some early adopters that can help me get going, some investors that can help me get going. But Stagegate, and whether you call it Stagegate or phase-gate process, it's just some kind of process. So once you have that success and once you're past 10, 20, 30 million, you start to get into scale issues. And if you have, hundreds of people and no process, and you have all these ideas for innovation, you're not going to get anywhere. You're really just not going to get anywhere. So you need some kind of process to build on that initial innovation. And, as the previous Bronson asked previously, what are the decisions you need to make? Is it an enhancement? Is it fundamentally new product? Or is it going into a new market? So I think there needs to be some level of lightweight process. I always, like to focus on talent over process, but at some point, just from a scale standpoint, you have to have it for sanity. You have to have strategy and process. I don't know, Matt or Beth, any opinions there?
I think you answered that pretty thoroughly, right? That's why, though, the light, we recognize that you don't want to bog down the organization with a heavy duty process. So you only put in as much process as required in the organization.
Right.
I'll just add one more thing. I work with startups a lot. I mentor at startup incubators. If you are running an organization that's bigger than a startup, you need to do things differently. Startup, you don't, as an established organization, regardless what size, you don't want the success rate of a startup. That is huge risk. I think what we're talking about here is, how do you increase your success rate, do it in a more sustainable, repeatable way?
Yes.
If our discussion was about how do we come up with the next Uber idea, how do we come up with the next Dollar Shave Club idea, and that's a little discussion. It's the discussion that's a little different, but actually it's not as different as you can imagine.
So in terms of my takeaway, it's all about those squirrel moments and just having an understanding or awareness of the maturity of your current organization, the readiness of your organization and priority of your organization to innovate. So awareness is that first step. Understanding if you have a problem or not and accepting that is that first step. So I think doing that assessment and that alignment with the team and really understanding where you are is key. And then having that honest conversation with the team and the executives to really put yourself in a position for that repeatable process, as Ahmet highlights.
So, well, anyway, I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today. We really appreciate the level of interaction and the very good questions that you gave us. We look forward to seeing you in our number 2 LinkedIn Live, and that's on May 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern. In session 2, we're going to dive right into building another building block of the phase gate light process, and we're going to talk about building the business case and why it matters, and then how to get the market research to validate the business case and gain input and alignment from your team. So the link to the event is in the live chat, and we'll also send out a reminder to sign up all of you as today's participants. And finally, you can see our contact information is here. Feel free to reach out to Angus, Ahmet, or myself if you have any additional questions or would like to learn more about implementing a phase gate light process in your own organization. Again, thank you today for your attendance and participation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Beth.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.